If you didn't already know, it will soon become apparent that I'm something of a biblical nerd. And as you saw this morning, that can get me into hot water with the young people. I love unpacking the different ways in which the Bible tells the story of Jesus. The details, it includes the way the narrative develops, the similarities and differences between the four Gospels. And nowhere is that more apparent than with the accounts of Jesus' birth. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke tell two completely different stories. And scholars have tied themselves in knots for years, trying to reconcile and harmonize the two accounts. If you want shepherds and choirs of angels, read Luke, because the shepherds aren't mentioned in Matthew. But if you love the account of the wise men, well, then you need Matthew, because Matthew tells their story and Luke doesn't. The Gospel of John takes a totally different approach, and it provides a lyrical, mystical, poetic affirmation of the power of Jesus' birth. It is moving and potent and quite unlike either Luke or Matthew. And this variety was part of the reason why we chose the theme, "What is the best Christmas story?" for Walton's Advent and Christmas series this year, so that we could take a closer look at each nativity story on their own and see how they share the good news of Jesus Christ. But what about Mark? If you turn to the beginning of Mark's gospel, you'll see that Jesus is already an adult. Mark begins with the account of Jesus' baptism, not Jesus' birth. And our reading today doesn't mention the event of Jesus' birth at all. There was no stable or angels. Maybe you even thought, there's been a mistake. But no. Today, I want to try and make the case that the best Christmas story from the Bible can be found in Mark, and particularly in Mark chapter 3, which we heard Rachel read earlier. And sure, this passage has little to do with the event of Jesus being born, but it has everything to do with the consequences of that moment. For when God became human, Emmanuel, one with us, God also became part of a human family. And based on the articles I've read recently and some of the conversations I've heard lately, for many people, this is one of the hardest parts of Christmas, dealing with the presence or absence of family. Mark shows us that Jesus gets that, because Jesus doesn't fit the traditional family picture. And we see that in two ways in our reading. On the one hand, there is the conflict and confrontation with Jesus' mother and brothers. And at the same time, there is a noticeable absence of any mention of Jesus' earthly father. This would have been particularly striking in biblical times, and yet Mark simply never mentions Joseph. Instead, Mark is writing an account of Jesus disconnected from conventional family. And at this time of year, this aspect of Mark feels particularly compassionate, because we need someone to understand our challenges of family or lack of family, and Mark certainly does. Mark would understand the frustrations of a tweet I saw this week describing a memory from previous festivities. It read, "My uncle walked into Christmas lunch, filled a plate, ate in a separate room, and left. He was here for 4 minutes." And maybe that's a blessing. I've had several conversations this week with colleagues of mine in the US who grumble about the nearness of their Thanksgiving and Christmas. "It's just too soon," said one, "to see all my family again." But for all these complaints, the alternative is harder still. The subject of estrangement is not widely talked about, and yet a recent study suggests that 1 in 4 people are isolated from at least one member of their family. This is a division that runs deeper than arguments and tension, although they can be linked. Estrangement develops out of contradictory beliefs, values, behaviors, and goals, and can last for months, years, or even a lifetime. And at this time of year, as we celebrate and perhaps idolize the Holy Family in our nativity scenes, such separation can be acutely painful. For the author Nadia Williams, the unexpected cause of her estrangement from her parents was her adult conversion to Christianity. Neither of her parents were actively religious. Her mother is a secular Jew, her father a Russian atheist, so she never anticipated that her faith would create such challenges. And yet for her mother, Christianity was inextricably linked with anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and so was an unacceptable betrayal of their family's past. Their relationship steadily deteriorated, and by the time Williams was preparing to get married to another Christian, the estrangement was absolute, and her parents refused to attend. Even the arrival of grandchildren has not healed the divide. Williams needs Mark's version of family. Because while Mark provides understanding to those struggling with family, but this is not to say that Mark or the Jesus he describes is against family. Rather, Mark's gospel shows Jesus reinventing family. "Who are my mother and my brothers?" he asks. Not the people outside looking to criticize and complain. "Here are my mother and my brothers," he proclaims. An inclusive, inviting welcome to those around him. And he goes on, widening the welcome yet further. "Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." Did you notice the extra word? The addition of sisters to the list of family. The women following Jesus, the women in Mark's own community, would almost certainly have noticed and felt themselves seen, felt included. Because in God's family, Jesus tells us, there is room for everyone. Nadia Williams found a version of this family and perhaps of Mark's Christmas at the live nativity scene staged by a local church. There they saw the conventional sheep and goats, accompanied by some historically unlikely bunny rabbits, along with some completely implausible llamas and alpacas. But as she laughed at the eclectic mix of animals, Williams realized that although the scene was historically inaccurate, theologically, it was spot on. As she reflected, God's family makes no sense in earthly terms, but sometimes the alpacas remind us of something the familiar witness of Bethlehem sheep cannot. And so, as we approach Christmas, there is no better time to celebrate the joy of God's deconstructed and redefined family, loving God and doing God's work. And it is this reimagined version of family, doing God's work, that Hoa Vo celebrates every Christmas as she honors a childhood memory. Vo is the daughter of Vietnamese refugees and came to Canada when she was 2 years old. Her family weren't well off, and for many years they couldn't and didn't celebrate Christmas. That changed when Vo was 6 years old in grade 2. That December, someone came to her house with gift boxes for her and her 2 brothers. At the time, she had no idea where the gifts came from or who the volunteers were. But in that moment, she felt that she was experiencing a significant part of Canadian culture as the boxes were delivered. As Vo recalls, I was like, "Oh, we get a present. This is what Christmas feels like." And today, she still has the magnetic checkerboard she received for that Christmas nearly 30 years ago. And the memory, as she puts it, "I just remember the joy." But along with the excitement, there was mystery and confusion. No one knew where the boxes came from. Years later, a family conversation goes searching again, this time with the help of the internet. And within a day, she had narrowed it down to the Toronto Santa Claus Fund, based on the charity's description and a photo of the gift boxes. And since she discovered the source of her Christmas gift, Vo also committed herself to paying it forward. She donates every year to the fund so that other financially vulnerable families can have their moment of festive cheer. As she says, "Whatever joy that I can give, I will." So, am I winning you over to Mark as the best Christmas story? After all, what makes a good Christmas story? What are the most important elements of the Christmas story that remind us of God's love for us? Firstly, I would say it needs to be a story that comes without expectations. Goodness knows, there's enough to do at this time of year without adding more to the list. It should be a story that includes everyone and accepts us as we are. And lastly, it should connect us to each other, reminding us of the abundance of God's love and affirming that we are all part of God's family. And so when Jesus welcomes and includes everyone with him that day as his brothers and sisters and mother, he is making room for everyone and sharing the heart of the Christmas story, simply being with us. So if this sounds like your kind of Christmas story, let's think for a moment about how we might be able to have a Mark-like Christmas. In a Markan Christmas, you begin by recognizing that you are enough. You are already enough. And tidying the house and making the gravy and wrapping the presents so that they look too good to open, none of that matters. You are already enough. And then you affirm that you are accepted and included in God's love. That when Jesus looked around the room announcing his brothers and sisters, he saw you. You are part of this eternal story of love and salvation. And finally, you remember that you are beloved. You are cherished by God like the most precious gift. You are a child of God, and you bring God joy. So as we journey towards Christmas and the traditional celebrations of Jesus' birth, let's also make a place for Mark and his reminder of just how unconventional and inclusive Jesus was. Whether we spend Christmas with 20 rowdy relatives or quietly with one or two friends, we equally get to spend Christmas in God's family, remembering that we are enough for God, that we are cherished by God, that we bring God joy. A friend of mine said to me in Bronte Hall just the other week, Christmas is not about the gifts you get. It's about being with the people you love. Mark and Jesus would agree. Thanks be to God.